ЄС. І я запрошую до слова представників громадської організації «Європа без бар'єрів».
Так, працює. Доброго дня, колеги.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and we'd like to present our short comments and analysis of the report by the European Commission published last week about the progress of Ukraine in visa liberalization. According to the assessment by the European Commission, if we generalize Ukraine has achieved a significant progress in 4 blocks of the visa liberalization action plan, and in 2 directions the criteria have been reached completely about the identification documents issuance. Also 8 directions almost fulfilled: migration management, money laundering, terrorism financing, the counteraction to the illegal turnover of drugs, and significant progress was achieved in the sphere of protection of personal data, and also in the sphere of freedom of travel movement within Ukraine. European Commission also designated 3 directions in which Ukraine has partially achieved the goals: human trafficking, human rights protection, including minorities. And if we talk about partially achieved criteria, the experts of the assessment mission we're talking about organized crime, fighting organized crime, and fighting corruption. So I give the floor to my colleague Iryna Sushko, who will dwell on the recommendations and the list of demands and the roadmap that Ukraine has to traverse in order to get a positive decision about visa-free regime with the European Union. Europe without barriers continues its systemic work in public independent monitoring of Ukraine's government's fulfillment of not just technical tasks within visa liberalization, but in essence reforms in very important directions of state policy. The visa-free regime we see as the final target and a rather efficient tool in order for the society to get the results out of modernization and transformation of such important spheres of state policy that are being embraced by the issues of security and internal policy, and such delicate topics for Ukraine as fighting trafficking, human trafficking, fighting corruption, fighting money laundering, identification documents, counteracting discrimination, etc. Ukraine's leaders have more than once said that Ukraine will get visa-free regime at the Riga summit. Now we understand clearly that this is not going to happen, and because of this we would like to call upon the leaders of the country to abstain from such loud statements in the future, because they bring about heightened expectations of the society and of citizens, and in fact they detriment the leaders of the country because they don't manage to answer for the statements that they produce. We also recommend to establish in order to better coordinate the work of all the respective ministries and departments, and to strengthen this coordination at the government level. Because as you probably know today, the department, the agency which is responsible for coordination is the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine, which often lacks authority and weight to organize the process of work with different agencies. And I think that it is feasible to organize a more centralized process. Also, we think the experts of Europe Without Barriers think that it is necessary to introduce certain correction of approaches to the implementation of the tasks of visa liberalization, and we are completely convinced that in order to do this, it is necessary to implement these recommendations, the workers of corresponding non-governmental organizations, which will strengthen the coordination of the fulfillment of the action plan for visa liberalization. Since 2010, our organization has been continuously monitoring this sphere. We constantly talk to mass media, and in fact, we are the only source of information about what's happening within this process, but apart from several agencies, for instance, the State Office on European Integration, Migration Service, and the Foreign Ministry, the government, I mean the highest governmental officials, have not approached us with a proposal to systematically cooperate. Using this opportunity, I remind you that we are ready to cooperate, and we have analysis and expertise that is required. So now about recommendations that the European Commission thinks are necessary to complete the reaching of the criteria and to receive the visa-free regime. For instance, in the block which pertains to the safety and security of documents, you know that Ukraine has started to issue biometric passports, and the European Commission recognizes this criterion as fulfilled, but we still have to equip the checkpoints with the equipment necessary to read fingerprints, and there's a recommendation from the European Union to faster provide for the functioning of the single state demographic register. We think that there is a necessity to hold internal discussion whether we really need this register, because as we told earlier, human rights activists and our colleagues who specialize in protection of personal data have more than once criticized the state register as such and the necessity of its introduction. The next recommendation is about illegal migration, including readmission. We all know that the armed conflict and the Russian aggression against Ukraine and events in the east of Ukraine do influence in a negative way the readiness of the European Union to adopt a positive decision, and we have already received a preliminary assessment from the European Union about migration risks from Ukraine, and they are rather high in the opinion of experts of the European Union. We think that there's a need to check and correct this data, adjust this data, and that's why I think migration profile is necessary and useful, which has to be prepared by the state migration service, and they should use other independent sources that would provide data on how many asylum seekers come from the territory of Ukraine, and whether we really pose a threat in the sense of migration risks to the European Union. So this is why there's a necessity to adopt a law on external labor migration and to strengthen the state migration service, which has a local tasks in visa liberalization. In asylum sphere, the European Union recommends to provide for legal help to asylum seekers and strengthen legal help for refugees, and a number of technical tasks that you can find in our press release. I'm now enumerating only basic and major recommendations, and as far as public order and safety is concerned, one of the biggest recommendations, one of the biggest directions this is, they recommend in the first turn to merge the plans, action plans, into one that will pertain to fighting organized crime and to reform the process of pre-court investigation in order to clearly distribute authority, to decrease the authority of the State Security Service of Ukraine in the pre-court investigation. And when we gave here a similar briefing before, they recommend to provide for the specialization of prosecutors and judges to consider cases linked to organized crime and to strengthen the activity of specialized units to protect witnesses. Another important recommendation to protect the rights of people in the country are recommendations within the sphere of fighting trafficking, human trafficking, to provide for the monitoring of the situation, especially in the context of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. We mean the internal trafficking, human trafficking, child trafficking in particular, to strengthen the process of identification of victims, including foreigners, and to introduce the system of monitoring assessment of the existing and future action plan, and also about fighting corruption, which is still urgent, to recommend the creation of anti-corruption coordination mechanism on a high level, and not only to create respective institutions, but to provide for their efficiency. And they have a number of recommendations that pertain to the creation of respective agencies to return money, to provide for the reforms, to remove immunity from judges. So this is quite a lot of recommendations that find a ready response within the Ukrainian society. And to round off, I will mention that it is necessary to improve the work in the direction of counteracting the illegal drug trafficking and financing of terrorism. And as far as law enforcement cooperation is concerned, there's still a recommendation to improve interdepartmental cooperation by ways of creating a platform to amalgamate or to join forces of the existing law enforcement systems and to strengthen cooperation with Europol. And now the last block, external relations and rights, about fighting discrimination. There's a recommendation that used to be there earlier to provide for the implementation of anti-discrimination legislation according to the existing standards of European and international standards, and also to introduce changes into the code of laws on labor about the ban on discrimination dependent on sexual preferences, and this in brief is all. And now I pass the floor to our colleague Alexandra Sushko, who apart from this list will provide an analysis of whether really all the recommendations and requests that EU gives us are well-founded, how we cope with efficient or non-efficient fulfillment. Now you'll hear this independent analysis.
Thank you. I have already mentioned about certain things in mass media, but what is important, the European Union issued the fifth report. That's the first report for the second phase of implementation of the action plan. And it has an interesting remark, the commitments of EU to provide the next report not during the year, but by the end of this year, within a shorter period of time, in a little more than in half a year. That is a certain reaction to the desire of Ukrainian side to get at least some signal as to the time frame for canceling Schengen visas. Those who want will read the signal. It's very clear signal. What does it mean? It means that in the end of the year, the European Commission forecasts the possibility to issue the next report, the sixth one, which will be the final one for Ukraine, and which will have the recommendation as to canceling visas for the citizens of Ukraine. This report will not automatically mean immediate cancellation of visas, but that's the procedure in European Parliament and the Council of Europe. There is we understand that there's a certain opposition to that, and we see the signs of this opposition now. Ukraine is in the situation where immigration potential grows objectively, but it depends on who emphasizes what. It is important not to allow our friends in inverted commas to use the difficulties in the country to postpone visa-free regime. In principle, this calendar, and for the first time the European Commission gives us a hint at a certain time frame. That means that not later than in October, 4 missions will come to Ukraine, and they will be working according to the action plan, and they will be working on 4 major directions. The main results are to be achieved by Ukraine before October, and also much depends on whether there will be those people in the authorities who will be able to clearly communicate about what's happening, because our observation of the missions that were taking place last month and the month before show that some of the executive authorities are in somewhat different dimension in some other planet, and they do not understand what should be said to who, what messages are expected. So the things which could be communicated better, could have been communicated better, they were not communicated, and sometimes the European experts had even worse impression than the situation in some spheres. Our champion is the Ministry of the Interior, and I can assure you that if they postpone the visa-free regime, then we will have no doubts about where and who has created biggest problems. But hopefully this will be corrected, but talking about the State Immigration Service, which is coordinated by the Minister of the Interior, that's where we have the biggest problems. Now we can correct these problems. They are not dramatic, but we see how the country is an hostage, becomes a hostage of that ministry. So addressing the problem is not just related to specific criteria. We understand that they will be monitoring specific items, but it's related to the general process of reforms of the executive authorities, in particular the Ministry of the Interior. And we hope now the comprehensive reform of militia is launched. That creates some hopes, and we hope that the problem will be comprehensively addressed, and people who will replace the old people will be able to explain to European Union using the criteria and the language which is needed to convince European side, to convince that we do understand who and how coordinates the combat to organized crime. We have few months to correct this situation. We understand that some of the issues are quite traditional. We expect some changes in legislation, the labor code. We expect some amendments related to the actions of investigators. We now have Anti-Corruption Bureau, and that means that it's not just that this bureau gets some functions, but that means that others are deprived of some functions, and the establishment of two anti-corruption bodies will be one of the major criteria, because anti-corruption is practically the only sphere of politics which gets the most negative assessment. In some other sectors, the results have been achieved or partially achieved, but what refers to anti-corruption sector, the situation is the worst. So this Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Agency of Preventing Corruption should become the bodies, not just on the paper, which they are now, but they should become the functioning bodies, so that they can state that these bodies are functioning. So this is all in general terms. These are political issues. Very often people ask, what about other countries? What's the situation compared to other countries? Because for us, Ukraine is really something very important, but for European Union, they look at Ukraine in a wider context. There is an active process with Ukraine and Georgia, because Moldova has received the visa-free regime. Now Georgia is ahead of us. If we read the report on Georgia, it's much more optimistic than Ukrainian. There are now negotiations going on about Turkey. Turkey is probably lagging back. It's behind Ukraine. But European Union should understand the logic of EU. The EU looks at it as a regional process. They allow the countries to compete between themselves. and Ukraine has not converted its political image into practical recognition. The visa liberalization is an indicator of what everyone's talking about. It's an indicator of non-completeness, of non-consistency of reforms. In other spheres, that does not have any consequences for citizens, but in this case, it does have consequences, because here it's about delaying visa-free regime, because we have not achieved what we planned to achieve a year ago. We were setting sometimes non-realistic targets, but that is not the first time when certain deadlines are not achieved. That means that forecasting is not good, that the actions were not well forecast. The fact of Georgia plays a constructive role for us because it allows us. That's another reason not to fail, because Georgia entered the period of liberalization 2.5 years later than Ukraine. So I believe that the state, at the political level, they will do everything possible so that Georgia and Ukraine simultaneously get a signal about visa-free regime, and it's desirable that this happens before the end of this year. I have a question.
Люблять таку
I understand that specialists do not love such questions and consider them non-professional, but I still cannot but ask, if we take, for instance, the scale of assessment, which would mean the highest degree and mark, what's your opinion? How realistic for Ukraine is to fulfill the conditions before October that would fill with the real contents this signal? Well, Europe without barriers has a good scale on their side. They have 10 points scale, and they have yellow, red, and green colors there. And it is also detailed and self-explanatory. Maybe the colleagues will comment. And you can see there. And then there's another project, the index of the visa liberalization of the Eastern Partnership countries. And you can see the color and numerical indicators rather good. You can see the differences. And in this sense, Ukraine, in some criteria, have the highest mark, and in some criteria, it's only in the middle of the scale. For instance, recently the Anti-Corruption Bureau was created, and its head was appointed, and 2 deputies, and they found the premises. This means that the indicator should be maybe yellow, and it used to be red. Now the Cabinet of Ministers has adopted a resolution on the National Office to Fight Corruption, so you can paint the indicator yellow, but step by step, because it is only just a resolution. And in order to make this green, it should be functional, like all the jobs taken, and some things are done. Biometric passports, they started to issue them, and in January the color was red, and at the moment it is almost green, although of course the rate of the presence of those passports is rather low. In Moldova, by the moment of the introduction of visa-free regime, more than half of the valid passports were biometric, and people could use them to travel abroad. In our case, even if they introduce a visa-free regime tomorrow, then maybe 2 or 3% of those who hold foreign passports could use biometric passports, as only some dozens of thousands were issued. The situation is dynamic and it is very different in different sectors. We don't have illusions that we can reach 10 points by October in every direction. But as practice shows, if there's a clear-cut trend towards fulfillment, then the European Union can recognize this as sufficient for the moment and then issue some tasks for post-monitoring period, because monitoring continues after the visa-free regime is introduced, because the legislation of the European Union provides also for the cancellation of visa-free regime, because if some country does not cope with all the requirements, then there are no grounds to continue with visa-free regime. And of course, there's a influence of a political factor. In some situations, the political factor does work, but we should not hope for lenience, for some special criteria, for special conditions. We should understand that, yes, there are powerful forces that are in favor of giving Ukraine a visa-free regime, but at the same moment, these are 28 countries after all, a lot of different moods, and only a consolidated position of all the 28 countries can give us a visa-free regime, so we should try to maximum, to the full, fulfill the requirements. Thank you, our speakers, and the adage that Ukraine never loses a chance to lose a chance loses its topicality, and we do